Before I moved to the Philippines, I was living what I would consider a pretty average life in the United States.
I was working full-time, 40 hours a week, sometimes more. I worked in the IT department at a golf resort with around 1,000 employees, and I had been there for about 6 years. Before that, I had lived in California for most of my life, but like many people, the cost of living kept getting higher. Rent was expensive, electricity was expensive, and it just felt harder and harder to get ahead. So around the age of 40, I made a move to Oregon, where I had family and where the cost of living was lower. At first, it seemed like a great decision. Rent was cheaper, bills were lower, and my commute went from something I absolutely hated in California to just a 5-minute drive to work. But after a while, I realized something. Even though things were cheaper, the pay was lower too. So in the end, it still felt like the same cycle. And if you wanted to travel or really enjoy life, it was difficult because you only had 2 days off. And like many people, I was planning for the future. I had a 401k, I had a stable job, good benefits, and a career in IT. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking, is this really what I want to do for the next 20 years of my life? And then, at 46 years old, I made a decision that would change my life. I had been in my job for 6 years. I had stability, good benefits, a 401k, and a clear path forward. But I also felt like I was living the same routine week after week, year after year. Working full-time, waiting for the weekend, and then before I knew it, Monday would come around again. Around that time, I had also met Sarah, who lived in the Philippines, and eventually, I decided to take a trip to finally meet her in person. But before I left, I made a decision. Instead of selling everything, like many people do, I put my belongings into storage because I wasn't completely sure what would happen. I wasn't sure if things would work out with Sarah. I wasn't sure if I would like living in the Philippines. And I didn't want to make a permanent decision until I experienced it for myself. The company I worked for actually had a program where you could leave and come back within 6 months without losing your seniority, your benefits, or your position. So I gave myself a 6-month window. If things didn't work out, I could come back, get my job back, and continue my life where I left off. At the time, it felt like a safe way to try something new without completely walking away from everything. But what I didn't realize was that those 6 months would change the direction of my life completely. When I first arrived in the Philippines, I didn't immediately think about moving here long term. At first, Sarah and I spent about 6 weeks traveling around, and one of the first things I noticed was how affordable travel was. Hotels were cheaper, food was cheaper, and even though traveling anywhere can still add up, I was spending far less than I would if I were traveling in the United States. But it wasn't until around 3 or 4 months that I really started understanding what it actually cost to live here.
And that's when things really surprised me. I started noticing you can rent a small apartment for around $300. And in some areas, you can even rent a small house, a 2 to 3 bedroom house for around $300 to $400 a month. That's just something I wasn't used to.
Back in the United States, I was paying well over $1,000 a month for rent. And in larger cities like Los Angeles or New York, you could easily pay $1,500 or even $2,000 for a small apartment. Even in larger cities here in the Philippines, like Manila, you can still find a nice condo for under $600 a month. And that's when I really started thinking, if my biggest expense was rent, and I could cut that expense in half or even more, how much less would I actually need to work? And it wasn't just rent, food was cheaper too. Unless I bought imported items, most local food was very affordable. Even something simple like getting a meal at McDonald's could cost about 1/3 of what it would cost in the United States. And little by little, I started realizing this wasn't just a vacation anymore. This could actually be a different way of living. Back in Oregon, I was living in what I would consider a more affordable area, and I was still paying around $1,000 a month in rent. It wasn't a luxury place. It was just a normal apartment in a lower cost of living area. But when I started looking at places in the Philippines, I realized I could rent a similar place for around $300 a month. That's about $700 every single month that I wouldn't need to earn anymore. And when you really think about that, that's $8,400 a year. 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 Then when you start adding in other expenses like food, transportation, and everyday costs, the difference becomes even bigger. Back in the United States, it felt like I needed to work full time just to keep up with bills. But here, I started realizing I didn't necessarily need to earn more. I just needed to spend less. And if I needed less money to live, then maybe I didn't need to work 40 hours a week anymore. Maybe I could work part-time or take a lower-paying remote job and still maintain the same lifestyle. And that's when things really started to change for me.
Because for the first time, I started thinking, what if? I didn't need to wait till 65 to start enjoying life. What if I could start now? Because the more I thought about it, the more I started realizing something.
Most of us spend our lives planning for someday. Someday we'll retire. Someday we'll travel. Someday we'll slow down. Someday we'll finally enjoy life. And there's nothing wrong with planning for the future. Saving for retirement, building a 401k, trying to create a better life later, those are all great goals. But at 46 years old, I started asking myself something different. What if someday never comes? What if you spend your entire life working, saving, waiting for retirement, only to reach 65 or 70 and not be able to enjoy it the way you imagined? Or worse, what if you never make it to retirement at all? I didn't want to wait until I was older, possibly needing a walker, or not having the same energy, to finally start enjoying life. I wanted to enjoy life now. Not stop working, but just not spend my entire life working. And when I realized that I could lower my cost of living and still maintain a comfortable lifestyle, it made me start thinking differently. That's when I realized I didn't want to wait. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized I didn't necessarily need to stop working. I just needed the flexibility to work less. When your cost of living is lower, you have more flexibility. Maybe you work less, maybe you take a remote job, or maybe you already have a job that you can do remotely. And that's when I started realizing this isn't just something that worked for me. This could work for a lot of people. If you already work online or have the ability to work remotely, moving somewhere with a lower cost of living could completely change your lifestyle. You might not earn as much, but if your expenses are lower, you may not need to. And instead of working your entire life waiting for retirement, you could start enjoying more of your life now. And that's what really started to change my mindset, because I wasn't just thinking about where I wanted to live. I was thinking about how I wanted to live. Now, my life looks very different. I still work, and in some ways, I actually work more than I did before. But the difference now is that I choose when I work. Instead of working a set schedule or a 9 to 5, I'm building something from the ground up. I'm working on YouTube, social media, and learning new skills. And because I'm building this for the future, there are times where I might work more hours, but it's different now. Because if I want to take a few days off, or even a week, I can. If I want to travel, I can. If I want to slow down, I can. I don't have to request time off. I don't have to wait for vacation days. And I don't have to plan my life around a work schedule. And that kind of flexibility was something I never really had before. Because even though I'm working, I don't feel like I'm stuck in a routine. I feel like I have control over my time. And to me, that's one of the biggest changes. And over time, what started as a 6-month test turned into something much bigger. As I spent more time here, I started realizing that this wasn't just a temporary change. This was something I could actually see myself doing long term. The lower cost of living, the flexibility, the ability to work on my own schedule. It all started to make sense. And of course, a big part of that decision was Sarah. Our relationship continued to grow, and eventually, we found out that she was pregnant. And that made the decision even more meaningful, because now, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about building a life together. But even beyond that, I also realized something else. Living here made it easier to enjoy life. Travel became more affordable. Daily life became less stressful, and I didn't feel like I was constantly working just to keep up with bills. And at some point, I reached the end of that 6-month window, and I had a decision to make. I could go back, keep my seniority, keep my benefits, and return to the same life I had before, or I could take a chance and stay. And in the end, I decided to stay, even though it meant giving up the security of my job and starting something new. I realized this was the kind of life I had been looking for. Now, I want to be clear, this kind of lifestyle isn't for everyone. Moving to another country comes with its own challenges. You're adjusting to a different culture, different systems, and sometimes things don't work the way you're used to. And there's also uncertainty. I left a stable job, good benefits, and long-term security, and that's not an easy decision to make. There are definitely moments where I still think about what life would be like if I had stayed, and even now, I still haven't sold everything I own back in the United States, because part of me wants to keep that option open. Sarah and I have even talked about possibly moving to the United States someday, so she can experience life there. So this isn't about saying that moving abroad is the only answer, but for me, it gave me something that I didn't feel like I had before. Time. Time to build something new, time to travel, and time to enjoy life now, instead of waiting for someday.
Because moving to the Philippines at 46 years old was one of the biggest decisions of my life.
I didn't move here to stop working. I didn't move here because I had everything figured out. I moved here because I wanted something different. I wanted more flexibility, more freedom, and more control over my time. Because the reality is, none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. We spend so much of our lives planning for the future, saving for retirement, waiting for someday. But I didn't want to wait until 65 or 70 to finally start enjoying life. I wanted to enjoy life now, and for me, lowering my cost of living made that possible. It gave me the opportunity to work differently, to live differently, and to focus on what really matters. And while this path may not be right for everyone, for me, it changed everything. Because in the end, I didn't move here to stop working. I moved here so I wouldn't have to spend my whole life working. And I'm curious, have you ever thought about working less and moving somewhere with a lower cost of living? Let me know in the comments. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. And if you're interested in seeing more about our life here in the Philippines, make sure to subscribe and follow along as we continue sharing our journey.